William Butler Yeates died in 1939, after a lifetime slowly becoming Ireland's greatest poet. W.H. Auden, his friend and oft-time critic, wrote a poem in his praise, in which he said, "You were silly like us. Your gift survived it all." After that kind of weak praise, he said, "Earth, receive an honored guest." William Yeats is laid to rest. This review will look at the two sides of William Butler Yeats. Out of necessity and his silliness, but also out of an even greater necessity, his greatness, because he did belong as an honored guest in the fraternity of great writers. Okay, let's make a confession. William Butler Yeats was a bit strange, at least by the heavy rationalism of the modern era. But we're rational because we need science. Science is our chance to escape catastrophe. Yeats said no to science, no to rationalism, and yes to art and poetry.
Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world.
I think Jordan Reed did a fantastic job of reciting that first four lines. Let's unpack what he said. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. What a momentous first two lines. Maybe the falconer is God and we are the falcon. Or at the very least, there's a sense that our whole world is coming apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. Yes, now we're starting to see something even more sinister. The sense that our values, our inner values, no longer matter. And this was very real to Yeats. He had lived through, in the last 4 or 5 years, the First World War and the Russian Revolution. And now, in 1919, 1920, the Spanish flu, which incidentally almost killed his wife, his pregnant wife, because she caught the flu, and pregnant women, 70% of them died. So his sense of uncertainty, his sense that Europe as a continent was the center of the world, a civilizing force in a world of barbarism, had suddenly vanished. Europeans had lost their sense of confidence. The center could no longer hold. That was the first four lines. Now let's return to Jordan Reed and his great recitation and look at what's happening next, because this story, which was never a happy one, is going to get a lot less happy.
The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity.
Okay, blood-dimmed tide. Well, there was a lot of blood. It could be World War I. 50 million died or something. Could be the Russian Revolution, which, by the way, that is a tale with a long tail. We're still seeing the Russian Revolution 2023 in the war in Ukraine. So the blood-dimmed tide is still very much with us. But then we start talking about something else. He keeps flipping. And he talks about the ceremony of innocence is drowned. To my mind, that can only mean Christian baptism. And now we're getting into something at a totally different level. We're talking about redemption, Jesus' arrival. We're talking about something else. So now it's starting to make a subtle shift away from the very, very, very dim stuff of the first 8 lines. Let's look at what he says, first glimmer of real hope.
Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming.
These are the words that are going to follow. Surely a revelation is at hand. surely is the second coming at hand. The second coming. The second coming. Momentous words, because if you've read Revelations in the Bible, you know they heralded the return of Jesus to earth. He would have ushered in an era of tranquility and peace. Another eon, 2,000 years, when goodness ruled the world. But hold on. Jordan Reed tells us what this new Messiah looks like. And I can promise you, he was no Jesus, he was no Messiah, he was no Savior.
Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere, in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds.
A creature with the body of a lion and the head of a man. That was a sphinx. Shelley had a sphinx in his great poem. Yeats has a sphinx in his. But his is a mobile sphinx. And it's not even remotely pleasant. Now, this whole 5 or 6 lines of description reminds me of a John Ford movie. You know, the one where the buzzards are overhead and the lone cowboy is riding across this desert and you could just feel the heat? Well, that's what this is. It's something terrible about to happen, and you know this whole scene is going to end badly. What I just said seems awfully gloomy. John Ford movies, buzzards in the sky. But remember, this time, 1919, 1920, was followed by the Roaring Twenties, when people went absolutely crazy. The flappers were in power. It was a time that everybody was doing everything they could do to drink or dance or just do whatever else they wanted to do to forget the misery that began in 1914 with the First World War and ended 6 years later with millions dying with the Spanish flu.
The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born.
I enjoyed this poem tremendously. I found it both subtle and fairly obvious, but the last part led me to be a little confused. First of all, he talks about a rough beast, obviously something pretty awful about to happen, the future of dismal events. But he's slouching towards Bethlehem to be born. Now, I suffer from the rationalism that Yeats so much hated. And I ask myself, how can a rough beast slouch towards Bethlehem to be born when he's already slouching? Okay, a Picayune point. It was a great image, the slouching beast going towards Bethlehem. And, by the way, if you're dealing with a world full of Christians, a fantastic image, because Bethlehem, of course, was where Christ was born. So now we have a rough beast, not a sweet little baby, but a rough beast, slouching towards the very place that Jesus was born. And it will usher in 2,000 years, because we remember everything's done with gyres. Another 2,000 years of misery, hatred, and dissolution. I don't know about you, but I can only hope William Butler Yeats and his mythology and his craziness and his greatness was wrong. W.H. Auden, probably one of Yeats's best friends and worst critics, said that he was a silly man. And I think we should amplify that. Obviously, I too believe that. But there's no words that I can find that would express my appreciation of his greatness as a poet. Silly as a man, great as a poet. Now, what was he silly about? Well, he was silly about almost everything to do with the occult. He believed in fairies, he believed in seances, he believed in secret societies, he believed in this, he believed in that. give Yeats something to believe in, and he believed in it, okay? So in that sense, he pretended to be a very kooky guy. But at the end of his life, he wrote this really interesting essay in which he said, and when he was asked, did you ever believe all this stuff? And he said, you know what? This material gave me unbelievable, unfathomable good stuff for my poetry. It was the imagery, it was the metaphor, it was the thing that kept it alive. And so I don't know whether mysticism drove his poetry or poetry drove his mysticism, but if I was a gambling man, I would say his poetry came first, his mysticism came second.